Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take these huge stacks of sources, articles, research, history, and really boil them down for you, tackling the big, messy questions. And today, we're wrestling with one that's been debated in courtrooms and, frankly, in our own heads for, 70 years now. How do we actually understand? How do we classify and then judge the people behind history's worst atrocities? Nazi leaders, genocide architects, mass terror ideologues.
It's a huge undertaking. And, the moment you ask that question, you hit this major paradox in how we think about justice today, especially with progressive ideas. We've gotten pretty sophisticated, or we like to think so, in understanding why people commit crimes, like common crimes, theft, fraud, assault.
Let's look for the why. Right,
Sure.
context.
Exactly. We look into trauma, bad environments, poverty, maybe undiagnosed mental health issues. And often, rightly so, we use that to argue for, mitigation, rehabilitation, not just pure punishment. We try to understand.
Okay, so here's the kicker, the irony you mentioned. If we accept that social factors, psychology can lessen blame for ordinary crime, do we dare? Can we even ethically apply that same logic to, say, an SS officer running a camp? Or a KKK ideologue? Or a terrorist leader?
Can that idea of an adverse environment somehow excuse someone who created the ultimate adverse environment for millions? It feels wrong, doesn't it?
It feels deeply uncomfortable.
And, okay, here's where it gets even more twisted. Often, the most hardcore followers of these extreme ideologies, race-based, religious, political, whatever, they're the first ones to scream bloody murder if you suggest mental illness or social background should excuse other criminals.
Oh yeah, they want maximum responsibility for the guy who steals a car or uses drugs.
Absolutely. You hear them say it all the time. You can't just kill someone and say you're crazy to get off, demanding total personal accountability. But then you look at the actual structure of their own ideologies, their political systems, if they get power, and what do you see? Classic psychopathic traits baked right in, huge grandiosity, narcissism off the charts, zero empathy, total willingness to manipulate, lie, destroy.
Wow, it's like the ultimate projection. They point fingers at individual chaos while their whole system is built on organized, state-sponsored cruelty. So that's our mission today, to dive into these sources and figure out, are these ideologies just some form of organized madness? Or are they something else? Maybe the most calculated, rational expression of human evil. And to do that, we really have to start where the world first confronted this head-on.
Yeah.
The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem.
1961. Yeah, that trial really set the stage for everything that came after, ethically, psychologically.
Okay, let's picture it. Jerusalem, 1961. The whole world is watching. Adolf Eichmann, captured dramatically in Argentina, is on trial. Wow. He wasn't Hitler, not one of the big charismatic leaders. He was the logistics guy, the architect of the final solution in terms of transport, schedules, budgets, death by bureaucracy.
He was the ultimate paper pusher for genocide, literally. And there he is, sitting in this specially built glass booth. Protected, yeah, but also on display, forced to face the survivors. And watching all this reporting for The New Yorker is the philosopher Hannah Arendt. Now, she went there expecting, like everyone else, to see a monster, a raving fanatic dripping with hate, something almost medieval.
But what she saw, it dropped a conceptual bombshell in the whole discussion, didn't it?
Yeah.
A phrase that stuck for decades.
Yeah.
The banality of evil.
The banality, yeah. It was shocking because it wasn't shocking, in a way. She didn't find this larger-than-life ideologue. She found mediocrity, a man who seemed disturbingly normal, almost boring. Gray, kind of wrote in his answers, seemingly unable to really think deeply even about the absolute horror he managed.
So what did he seem concerned about during the trial, according to Arendt? Not justifying the Holocaust on some grand philosophical level.
No, not at all. His worries seemed incredibly mundane, almost petty. Things like his career path in the SS, bureaucratic efficiency, making sure the trains ran on time, following all the rules and regulations the Reich put out. And his defense, over and over again, almost tiresome, was just, I was carrying out orders, I was obeying the law of his country as it existed then. He even claimed he had no personal animosity. He was just doing his job, a cog in the machine.
In Arndt's take on that, her conclusion was the really terrifying part, wasn't it?
Utterly terrifying. She concluded that this absolute, unprecedented evil didn't actually require absolute monsters to pull it off. It could be planned, organized, industrialized by ordinary men, average men, mediocre men even, men who had simply abdicated their most fundamental human capacity, the ability to stop, think critically, and judge the moral weight of their own actions.
So evil becomes administrative.
Exactly. Just another task on the desk. She saw Eichmann treating human lives like inventory figures, mass murder like a complex logistics problem to be solved efficiently. What was so powerful and controversial about her idea was that it shifted the focus away from some innate demonic evil inside the person and towards the system itself, towards the failure of individual conscience within that system.
And it's wild because almost at the same time, psychology experiments started popping up that seemed to back this up empirically, right? This idea of the system's power over the individual.
You're absolutely right. It's uncanny. While Arendt is writing Eichmann in Jerusalem, social psychologists are running these experiments that seem to show, yeah, normal people can commit shocking acts of cruelty under the right or wrong circumstances.
The big one, obviously, the one everyone knows, is the Milgram experiment, conducted at Yale right after the Eichmann trial started. Let's really unpack that one.
Okay, Stanley Milgram wanted to test obedience to authority. He brought in ordinary people, volunteers from the community. They were told they were part of a learning experiment. They were assigned the role of teacher. Their job was to give electric shocks to a learner who was actually an actor every time the learner got a question wrong. And the shocks got stronger with each mistake. Now, the shocks weren't real, but the teacher, the participant, absolutely believed they were. They could hear the learner grunting, shouting, eventually falling silent.
And the results. They still just floor you, don't they?
They really do. Milgram asked psychiatrists beforehand to predict how many people would go all the way to the highest voltage, marked like 450 volts, danger, severe shock. They predicted maybe 1%, maybe 2%, only the true sadists. The reality, 65%, nearly two-thirds in ordinary people went all the way to the maximum shock level. Why? Simply because the authority figure, this guy in a white lab coat, kept calmly telling them to continue. Using phrases like, the experiment requires that you continue, or you have no other choice, you must go on.
Just the authority of the uniform, the legitimacy of the setting, that was enough to override their own moral sense, their own discomfort at hurting someone.
It seemed to be. It wasn't about personal cruelty for most of them. They were often distressed, arguing, sweating, but they complied. It's that chilling echo of Eichmann. I was just following the procedures of the organization.
Did Milgram test variations?
Oh, yes, and that's crucial. When he changed the conditions, obedience levels plummeted. If the authority figure gave orders by phone instead of being right there, obedience dropped way down. If the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto the shock plate, even lower. If there were two authority figures arguing about whether to continue, obedience basically vanished. People stopped almost immediately.
So it really points to the power of the situation, the context, not just the person's inherent nature.
Exactly. It showed how malleable behavior could be under specific pressures.
And then, a decade later, 1971, you get the Stanford prison experiment, which took it a step further, looking not just at obedience, but at how quickly people adopt roles.
Right. Philip Zimbardo. He took psychologically screened, healthy male university students, randomly assigned them roles, prisoner or guard. Set up a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building. You were supposed to run for 2 weeks. They had to shut it down after just 6 days.
Because things got out of hand that fast.
Horrifyingly fast. The students assigned as guards. They spontaneously became tyrannical. They invented cruel, degrading, dehumanizing punishments. They weren't told to do most of it. They just slipped into the role. And the power corrupted them almost instantly. And the prisoners, they became passive, submissive, emotionally distressed. Some had breakdowns. They weren't acting anymore. They were prisoners.
So taking Milgram and Stanford together, the takeaway seems pretty clear, and it feeds right back into Arendt's initial observation, doesn't it?
It really does. You don't necessarily need to be a monster, a born psychopath, to participate in monstrous acts. Sometimes all it takes is an order from someone who looks like they have authority, or a powerful role within a system, a uniform. A system that normalizes cruelty, makes it routine, dehumanizes the victims. It essentially manufactures the perpetrator out of ordinary material.
It makes doing terrible things just part of the job description.
Precisely. It shifts the perceived responsibility away from your own conscience and onto the requirements of the role or the orders from above.
Okay, so we've got the banal functionary, the Eichmann Arendt saw, and we'll get back to this. The hardcore ideologue exists too. But there's this really important middle ground, right? The manipulated follower, the person whose will seems almost hijacked by a group. This is where we get into cults, destructive sects, extremist cells.
Yes, this is a crucial category because here, the leaders aren't just giving orders. They're actively reshaping the follower's entire reality through psychological coercion. It's like psychological warfare on an individual level. They use specific techniques. Isolation is key, cutting people off from outside information, from family, from anyone who might challenge the group's narrative.
Creating an echo chamber.
Totally. Then there's emotional manipulation. Often starts with intense love bombing, showering the recruit with affection and acceptance, making them feel like they finally found where they belong. But that's paired with the threat of withdrawal, the fear of being shunned or punished if they step out of line.
And building that us versus them mentality, that seems critical too.
Absolutely essential. The group becomes the sole source of truth, validation, even salvation. Everyone outside is deceived, corrupt, or evil. The individual gives up their autonomy, often believing they're gaining something far superior, special knowledge, moral purity, a sacred mission.
Can we look at a specific example? How does this play out in a more political, militant context? The sources mention El Yunque.
Right. El Yunque is a really stark example. It's a secretive, fascist organization investigated in Spain called a terrorist group in Mexico. Their methods for ensuring loyalty and controlling members are textbook manipulation, aimed at breaking down existing morality.
How do they do that? The sources talk about initiation rituals.
Exactly. They don't just ask for belief, they demand action. Aspiring members are ordered to commit specific acts. These might seem relatively minor on their own, maybe breaking the windows of an abortion clinic, acts of vandalism, or joining these aggressive protests to intimidate doctors or women seeking health care. The specific crime isn't really the point.
So what is the point? It's not just about seeing if they'll obey.
It's deeper than that. It's about fundamentally reframing the act itself. Through the group's lens, it stops being vandalism or harassment. It gets relabeled internally. It becomes a sacred duty, an act of faith, a necessary step to defend God or the nation or whatever the higher cause is. And once you've committed that act, which you know is illegal and potentially immoral by outside standards, but you've done it for the group, you're psychologically bound, you've crossed a line. It creates complicity and reinforces the us versus them bond.
And this pattern, this kind of manipulation, the sources suggest it's key to understanding fascist groups more broadly, especially the hypocrisy.
Oh, the hypocrisy is central. It's almost defining. Look at groups like El Yunque or historical Spanish fascists. Outwardly, they project this image of supreme moral purity. They're the defenders of Christianity, tradition, family values. They claim to be above petty things like money or personal gain.
Almost like they're morally superior to everyone else.
That's exactly the image. Their grandiosity is immense. They often genuinely seem to believe they have a direct line to truth or God, that they're above established authorities, even the church, like the Vatican, which they'll often dismiss as being infiltrated by communists or Masons or liberals, corrupted.
But behind that facade, the reality painted by investigations is very different.
Completely opposite. The sources consistently show leadership driven by raw greed, corruption, power hunger, financial scandals, abuse of trust, sometimes truly perverse personal behaviors. They use the language of high morality to mask these incredibly base motives and actions. It's a profound cynicism. Power is the real goal, dressed up in sacred robes.
This deliberate manipulation, promising spiritual elevation while demanding actual criminal or immoral acts. It leads to the most extreme example we see today, doesn't it? The suicide bomber.
The suicide jihadi, yeah. That's perhaps the ultimate endpoint of this kind of psychological coercion. The handler, the leader, isn't just asking for obedience or even a crime. They're promising literal paradise, eternal reward for self-destruction and the mass murder of innocents. And it's all justified through this incredibly twisted, narrow, fundamentalist reading of religious texts. The recruit's entire reality life, death, meaning afterlife, has been completely rebuilt by the ideology and the intense pressure of the group.
Which brings us back to that really difficult question of blame, of culpability for this specific category. If someone's perception, their whole way of thinking has been so systematically warped and coerced, if they've been isolated, manipulated, maybe even terrorized by the group, are they as fully responsible as the leader who did the manipulating? Or does that psychological coercion maybe mitigate their guilt to some degree? Courts wrestle with this constantly with extremists.
They do, and it's a vital distinction to try and make. But before we get too far down that path, we absolutely have to circle back and challenge our starting point. We need to question that initial image of the architect as just a thoughtless bureaucrat. We need to revisit Eichmann, because the banality story, well, it turns out it wasn't the whole story, not by a long shot.
Right. So for decades, Arendt's idea of the banality of evil really shaped how we thought about perpetrators like Eichmann. It was influential, powerful, and maybe in a way a little comforting. It suggested maybe any of us could become that cog in the machine under the right circumstances. But that whole framework rested on one huge assumption. that the Eichmann we saw in that glass booth in Jerusalem, the dull bureaucrat, was the real Eichmann.
Exactly. And critical historical evidence that came to light later completely shatters that assumption. What if that performance, the mediocrity, the deference to rules wasn't genuine? What if it was a calculated act, a mask put on by a very intelligent man fighting for his life?
And the key evidence here, the thing that blew the lid off, was the Sasson recordings, right? Tell us about those.
Okay, so back in 1957, Eichmann is hiding out in Buenos Aires. This is years before he's captured. He feels relatively safe. And he spends hours, many hours, talking candidly with a Dutch journalist named Willem Sasson, who was himself a former Nazi sympathizer. Eichmann thought he was among friends, basically. He believed he was setting the record straight for history, talking to people who understood him. He let his guard down.
And the Eichmann on those tapes is a completely different person from the one Arendt described.
Night and day, absolutely. The Eichmann talking to Sasson is anything but banal. He is a hardcore, committed, fanatical Nazi. He's deeply, virulently anti-Semitic, and he is chillingly, unreservedly proud of his work organizing the final solution. Far from being some reluctant paper pusher just following orders, he actually expresses frustration, real anger that he wasn't more successful, that they didn't kill more Jews.
That's not just a subtle difference. That completely flips the script. There's a specific quote from those tapes. It's just devastating, isn't there?
It is. It leaves no doubt about his actual mindset. He says, and this is chilling, to be honest with you, if of the 10.3 million Jews, we had killed 10.3 million, then I would be satisfied and say, well, we have destroyed an enemy.
Satisfied. Destroyed an enemy. He's not talking about logistics there. He's framing mass murder as a strategic victory against a foe and expressing personal satisfaction in that goal, even if it wasn't fully achieved.
Precisely. The tapes make it undeniable. Eichmann deliberately lied at his trial. He constructed that persona, the obedient functionary, the man without thoughts of his own, because he understood the post-war climate. He was trying to appeal to a logic that might save him from the death penalty. Arendt, brilliant as she was, analyzed the mask, and a perfectly crafted mask, yes, but still a mask. She captured the potential for systemic evil to become banal, but she missed the burning fanaticism of the man wearing it.
Okay, so if the architects, the leaders like Eichmann, weren't just mindless cogs, and they weren't just manipulated followers either, if they were in fact true believers, deeply convinced, even proud of the evil they were doing, then we have to ask, what fueled that? What kind of intellectual framework, what ideological poison could possibly power that level of calculated, systematic hatred? They didn't just make this stuff up out of thin air.
No, they didn't. The Nazi ideology was monstrous, yes, but it desperately sought a veneer of intellectual respectability. It tried to create its own twisted rationality. So to understand that, we have to look at how they grabbed ideas from legitimate thinkers, philosophers, psychologists, and completely distorted them, savagely co-opted them to build an intellectual alibi for cruelty.
Okay, where do we start? The sources point heavily towards Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher of the Superman, the Übermensch, and the will to power. How did his ideas get twisted?
Well, Nietzsche's philosophy is complex, often contradictory, and deeply critical of conventional morality. His famous line, "God is dead," wasn't a celebration. It was an observation about a crisis of values in modern Europe with the decline of religion and the rise of science. He was challenging people to find or create new values. The Nazis heard "God is dead" and took it as, great, no rules, anything goes, we can kill whoever we want. It became a license, not a diagnosis.
And the Übermensch, the Superman. That sounds like something they'd latch on to.
Oh, absolutely. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch was this ideal of someone who overcomes their own limitations, creates their own values through self-mastery and creativity, rising above what he called herd morality. The Nazis just stripped all the nuance away. They took Judeo-Christian ethics, things like compassion, pity, equality, and labeled them slave morality, supposedly invented by the weak to hold back the naturally strong. Therefore, they argued, the superior Aryan race, the Übermensch embodied, had not just the right, but the duty to cast off these weak morals, create their own values based on strength, and dominate or eliminate the inferior.
So basic human empathy becomes a sign of weakness, and violence becomes a sign of strength, a philosophical virtue.
Exactly. It's a horrifying inversion. Nietzsche's complex, often anguished philosophical explorations were warped into a justification for brutality. It gave educated Nazis, people who wanted to see themselves as more than just thugs, an intellectual permission slip for sadism. It wasn't base cruelty, it was philosophical toughness.
Okay, so Nietzsche provided a twisted philosophical backbone. What about psychology? The sources mention Carl Jung.
Right. When the Nazis took power, they needed to purge German science and academia of Jewish influence. Psychology was dominated by Freud, a Jew, so Freudian psychoanalysis had to go. They needed a non-Jewish psychology, an Aryan psychology. Carl Jung, a hugely influential figure, stepped into that vacuum. His own level of personal sympathy with Nazi ideas is still debated by historians, but factually, he accepted the presidency of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy after the Nazis had reorganized it and purged Jewish members.
And critically, didn't he start talking about racial differences in the psyche?
Yes. That was the key contribution that the Nazis seized upon. Jung began theorizing about fundamental differences between what he called the Aryan unconscious and the Jewish unconscious. He put forward this idea that Jews, because of their history as nomads, lacked a deep instinctual connection to the land, to the earth, and therefore, he claimed, they couldn't create a truly authentic, rooted culture of their own. They were supposedly rootless, parasitic.
Wow, that's basically academic window dressing for raw street-level anti-Semitism.
Precisely. It gave a sophisticated, pseudoscientific gloss to the crude prejudice. It allowed Nazis to say, see, even this famous psychologist recognizes the fundamental difference, the inherent problem with the Jewish psyche. So look, neither Nietzsche nor Jung created the Nazis. We have to be clear about that. But their ideas, ripped out of context, simplified, distorted, and weaponized, they became incredibly useful tools. They provided an elevated language, a philosophical and psychological framework for men who already harbored deep hatred, narcissism, and psychopathic tendencies.
It allowed them to frame their cruelty, not as a personal failing, but as a sign of their intellectual and racial superiority. It turned evil into a kind of high-minded virtue.
Exactly. It was the ultimate intellectual alibi.
Okay, so we've gone through the banal bureaucrat, the manipulated follower, the fanatical leader, and the twisted ideas they used. It brings us right back to that core question we started with. When we look at these architects of atrocity, Eichmann, the ideologues, the leaders, are they criminals? Or are they mentally ill in a way that might lessen their responsibility?
Well, based on everything we've looked at, particularly the evidence like the Sasson tapes for Eichmann, the argument against mitigating their responsibility seems overwhelming. Calling them mentally ill in a way that excuses their actions, that feels like a profound mistake. It kind of lets them and the systems they served off the hook too easily.
Why is it a mistake, specifically?
Because they weren't acting under some kind of delusion that made them unable to understand reality. That's the usual legal standard for insanity, right? Being unable to distinguish right from wrong because of a mental defect. These individuals operated with chilling rationality within their own poisonous, ideologically constructed reality. They made plans, they organized logistics, they held meetings, they wrote memos, they calculated quotas. It was cold, purposeful, goal-oriented action.
Their actions were perfectly logical, terrifyingly consistent, if you accepted their premise of who the enemy was and what needed to be done.
Exactly. And if they did have psychopathic traits, the lack of empathy, the grandiosity, the manipulativeness, those traits weren't the cause of some breakdown that absolves them. Those traits were the very tools that made them so frighteningly effective as agents of that ideology. Their psychopathy wasn't an illness that excused them, it was a qualification that enabled them.
So they weren't crazy in the sense that they couldn't tell right from wrong. They do. They just deliberately chose to redefine wrong as right, redefine evil as their highest good.
That's precisely it. They consciously inverted morality to serve their ideology. So the verdict really has to be that they were criminals, fully responsible individuals who made deliberate choices to embrace and execute an ideology of hatred and mass destruction.
So if we talk about sickness here, the illness wasn't really located just inside the head of one person, like Eichmann.
No, that's the crucial shift in perspective. The real profound illness was collective. It was the sickness of a whole society, or large parts of it anyway. A system that allowed hatred to become policy, allowed cruelty to become a virtue, allowed genocide to be discussed calmly in conference rooms like any other business plan. That system actively selected for and rewarded the absolute worst human traits. Ruthlessness, lack of conscience, blind obedience, ambition untethered from morality.
And the people who thrived in that system, from the top leaders down to the Eichmanns,
yeah,
they weren't really victims of some uncontrollable pathology.
No, they were its agents, voluntary agents, often proud agents. They chose to participate, to excel within that system.
So judging them as criminals, holding them fully responsible, it's not just about revenge or punishment for the past.
It's more fundamental than that. It's a necessary affirmation of human agency, of moral responsibility itself. It's drawing a line in the sand and saying, no, you can't hide behind orders or ideology or psychological labels forever. You chose this.
That feels like a vital point to end on. Thank you. That was,
Yeah.
well, it was a heavy dive, but incredibly important.
It is heavy stuff. And maybe just one final thought for you, the listener, to chew on as you think about all this. If we accept that a system can be set up to reward psychopathic traits and even provide fancy philosophical justifications for them, ask yourself, are there any contemporary systems, maybe political, maybe social, maybe even corporate structures that might be subtly doing something similar today? Selecting for people whose lack of empathy makes them incredibly efficient or successful within that system, even if the outcome isn't genocide, but maybe massive social harm, environmental damage, or economic devastation. Worth thinking about where that line between ruthless efficiency and dangerous psychopathy might lie in our own world.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.